You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We are going to be discussing Ebola with a guest from the Hoover Institution, John Villasenor.
Thank you for the opportunity to be on.
Well, listen, this is your first time joining us here on the Final Say radio program. And, boy, your bio reads like a mouthful. Of course, you come here on behalf of the Hoover Institution, where you're a fellow, but I understand you're also a senior fellow over at Brookings. You're involved in the Council on Foreign Relations, involved at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. You're also a professor of electrical engineering and public policy at UCLA. When do you sleep, John?
At night.
Okay. Well, good for that. Well, listen, I want to jump right into the issue at hand we have here. You wrote a piece that we had received from Hoover that really addressed something that I wanted to touch on because I think is very, very important, and that is essentially, are we blaming the healthcare workers for what's happening in Ebola instead of public policy? So I wanted you to speak first and foremost to that very specific issue, because it seems to me that we have a lot of public policy failures, but we're always very quick to blame individual humans. But I think public policy should, in general, make the assumption that humans will get it wrong, and that's why the policy itself has to be very tight, very accurate, and, of course, the public must trust that policy.
Right. So I should give the important qualifier that I'm not a medical doctor and don't claim any medical expertise. To the extent that I have something to add to the overall debate on response to Ebola, it's been at looking at some of the statistics and how we might perhaps better use statistics to handle the problem. And so the piece that you're speaking about is an article I published in Forbes over the weekend, and it was spurred by, of course, as everyone knows, on October 12th, officials in Texas announced that a health worker, turned out to be a nurse, who had provided care for the Ebola patient who had arrived from Liberia and then subsequently died. A health worker was diagnosed with Ebola. And in an interview later on that day, the head of the CDC, Dr. Thomas Frieden, said, quote, "Clearly there was a breach in protocol," close quote, and really implying that the health worker or the hospital were somehow at fault for the transmission. But I think, and as I wrote in that piece, that really sidesteps what I call the statistical elephant in the room. And this is how it works. If you do something once, and let me sort of back off and explain a bit. As everyone knows, when you're treating an Ebola patient, you're supposed to be in this protective gear. But that protective gear is, from what I've heard, it's not easy to use, perfectly. And in fact, Dr. Thomas Frieden, the head of the CDC himself, said in a news conference, I'm reading from a transcript here, but the quote, "The care of Ebola can be done safely, but it is hard to do it safely. It requires meticulous and scrupulous attention to infection control, and even a single inadvertent innocent slip can result in contamination," close quote. The challenge is when you take the laws of probability and statistics, you very quickly conclude that there is inevitably going to be some transmission, even to conscientious health workers. And here's why. Basically, if you do something that has a low probability of a very negative consequence, and if you do it once, your risks of harm are pretty low. But if you keep doing it, then eventually the odds are going to catch up with you. And so what I gave an example, for example, that suppose you do something that every time you do it, you have a 1% chance of being exposed to a highly dangerous chemical. Well, if you do it only once, of course, you've got a 1% chance of exposure. But if you do it 20 times, then you have about an 18% chance that you've been exposed at least once. And by the time you get up to 250 times, the odds are about 92% that you've been exposed at least once. So if you have lots of healthcare workers all having lots of contacts with an Ebola patient, then these small odds get amplified, and we shouldn't be surprised if there are some transmissions. And I think it's the statistics which helps drive that probability, and then to suggest that the health workers were somehow responsible for contracting Ebola is to me, statistically incorrect and also disrespectful. I mean, clearly these health workers have a very strong incentive to protect themselves. So that's perhaps a longer summary than you wanted, but that's the gist of what I had written in the Forbes article.
No, I think that's actually very important. You may recall, this is something almost every teenager gets at some point from their math teacher, right? Would you rather have $1 million or $1 doubled to, I think it was 20 times, right, or 25 times?
Right.
But you remember the answer, of course, is you don't want the $1 million. You want the one doubled. Now, that's one-to-one exposure. If you consider the risk of, for example, somebody getting on an airplane, as we just saw happen, and then you have the additional people that they contacted as well as the people who are in contact with the people who they contacted, and very quickly you start to have an understanding of not just the medical downsides, the potential for an epidemic to really grab hold, but the absolute infrastructure and financial disaster that could go along with this. Because even if we end up having a relatively modest number of total people affected, the costs that directly affect our ability to provide other forms of care, right? There's no such thing as free money. Every dollar spent is an opportunity cost to be providing health care elsewhere. And that's a huge concern for me. And so with that in mind, would you consider this first and foremost a public policy failure, or is this just something that we have to get used to because throughout history there's always been epidemics and there's no real way to have an effective public policy?
Well, I certainly wouldn't adopt the view that, hey, it's just that's just the way it goes, that we have epidemics and there's nothing we can do about it. I'd like to think that we can do a lot. A couple of comments to respond to what you just said. So I think healthcare workers are in a very different position with respect to exposure risks than somebody, for example, who might have sat 30 rows back on an airplane. That in no way is intended to diminish the concerns. If you have somebody with Ebola traveling on an airplane, that is absolutely a concern. I'm not suggesting it isn't, but simply that the magnitude of risk is far greater if you're a healthcare worker who's actively contacting the patient and being directly obviously one hopes protected by this protective gear, but still being in contact with the materials that are actually containing the virus. So I think there's two very different sort of questions that can be asked. One is sort of the general population, and then the other is those health workers who are actually contacting the patients. The other thing is in terms of whether there's a public policy failure. I don't want to be too quick to criticize in the sense that I'm not the one who's on the front lines actually formulating policy on this, and I do it's one of these things where if people in those positions do 99 things right and one thing wrong, then everyone jumps on them for getting the one thing wrong. So I respect that the people who are trying to address this from a policy standpoint are in a very difficult position, and clearly they're obviously doing the best that they can. Having said that, I still think that there is there are always ways that you can do better. And I think one way in which this country could do better is a more clear-eyed view of analyzing some of the risks and the statistics that can help explain those risks that are out there, and then to adjust the policy as a result of that. Because clearly, and again, as we saw even today, there was another case that was revealed. Clearly, we haven't quite figured it out.
Yeah, this is Brett, by the way. Well, welcome. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say that this is one case where, it's very easy for all of us, interested in politics or interested in policy to, pick on one side or the other when things go wrong. But this is such a dire situation, or could be, that, you hate to bring the politics into it, but really want to focus on what is really the best policy, and not to ridicule somebody for, a political purpose, but simply because you're trying to ensure that in a case where people could die very easily and it could spread very quickly, that you're really doing what is best. And I agree with you 100%. I don't know how you blame a healthcare worker unless they do something that's completely irresponsible, but I seriously doubt it. As you said, they have something at risk. They have their lives, and I'm sure that they take every precaution possible, and they have no choice. It's their job to be in the line of fire, if you will, where, we could simply choose to stay away from public places, or not to travel to Africa, or to stay away from places where cases exist or whatnot. But the healthcare worker, They have to show up to work. They have to treat the patient, the doctor and the nurse and the staff. They have to do their job.
Right, and I think healthcare workers deserve utmost respect, and they deserve to have us do everything we can possibly do to minimize the probability or the chances that they could become exposed. A, because it's the right thing to do, and B, because more broadly, if we're going to stop the spread of not only Ebola but similar or other pathogens like it, which are certainly going to emerge down the road, we have to get those odds of transmission as low as possible. And I don't know that they're as low as they could be right now.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on obviously we have, if not the world's best healthcare system, amongst the world's best and most capable healthcare system. But are smaller hospitals or smaller facilities in places where they may not have as much funding as some of the bigger cities or bigger systems, are they prepared to handle the possibility of an outbreak of not just Ebola, but any significant virus or strain of something that's life-threatening?
Well, and it's a great question, and you probably don't like it when guests do this, but I'm going to tell you that I don't really feel comfortable answering that because I haven't personally. I wouldn't consider myself an expert on hospital preparation. I will note, however, that there was an interesting survey that was released in the last couple of days. There's an organization called National Nurses United, and they did a survey very recently, and they announced of registered nurses across the United States, and they announced the result. And among the results they announced is, I'll read from their press release here, it says 85, then they got about 2,000, it says as of Sunday midday they'd had 2,000 are registered nurses at more than 750 facilities in 46 states and the District of Columbia who'd responded. Among the results, quote, 85% say their hospital has not provided education on Ebola with the ability for the nurses to interact and ask questions, close quote. And so that's a sobering statistic in that it means at least there's quite a bit of opportunity to improve education. So I think one part is improving education of really the people who are going to be in the front lines, because we don't know, right? We don't know where the next case is going to be, and it could be at any of these places. Somebody could walk into an emergency room quite literally in any facility in the country and be somebody who's perhaps at risk of an Ebola case. And so there's that. And then, but there's also the question of whether the protocols themselves are indeed sufficiently protective. And again, I'm not an expert on all the different protective gear and exactly how it should be removed or put on, but I would suspect, as with anything else, there are choices to be made and variations. And I think obviously I would hope people are looking very carefully at that, because in other words, I don't think it's the right assumption to assume that the protocol is perfect, and to the extent that there are any failures, they're failures sort of hospitals and training their staff members. It may well be that the protocol does need to be improved, and until we know more information, we're not going to know exactly where the weak links are. But there are ways to fix it. We shouldn't. The other thing, I wrote a piece I published in Slate today, and my point was that we shouldn't be using healthcare workers as guinea pigs, right? We shouldn't be doing this sort of what amounts to a trial and error process of learning what works and what doesn't in terms of preventing transmission to health workers at the cost of these health workers who then become exposed. That doesn't seem right. It seems like we ought to be able to, this country, which has, as you pointed out, if not the best, among the best healthcare capabilities on the planet, we can do better than that, and we should.
It's a couple of interesting angles that you bring up. So first, I personally believe that the CDC, which of course is a big component of what makes up the World Health Organization's effective response, I think the CDC has to be the one who's really providing the protocols, and those protocols need to be somehow separated from public policy and the political side. And I'll get back to that momentarily. But with that in mind, it seems to me that there is a huge burden being placed upon all healthcare workers. We do understand that they need to be trained to help target this, to find potential victims when it first happens. However, once somebody is either diagnosed or we are watching people who are in immediate close proximity, especially to body fluids and things like that, of people who have been diagnosed or at high-risk list, it seems to me that those people actually need to be moved to a CDC-managed and controlled area, and that, to me, seems like one of the greatest failures. And that may look a lot like one of these typical B movies, but the reality is the best way to provide care for those people and to prevent spreading, I would think, is to contain these people until they're proven safe in an area where the best care can be provided and the minimum number of caregivers are actually being exposed.
So that's a very interesting point, and without disagreeing with it, let me just add another kind of wrinkle to the challenge. So what I've read is that the second nurse who was diagnosed as being infected with Ebola in Dallas is going to be transferred to exactly one of these CDC facilities that you mentioned, which I believe you had in mind. In this case, I believe it's at Emory, and I believe that's what you're saying is that these people should be in fact. Right, and so certainly to the extent that that's possible, that is obviously best to have these people treated at the highest level facilities. The problem is that approach doesn't scale. In other words, if we've got a small handful of cases, one here, one there, then yes, each one of those people can be physically transferred to one of the handful of facilities we have at the highest levels and cared for. But what happens if there are 20 cases at the same time, or 200, or gosh, I hope it never happens, but 2,000? If that happens, then obviously then that wouldn't work anymore, right? And so there may be a need to have security at the endpoints with respect to treating these patients, and I think we need to be prepared for that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Now, I want to go back to the political side of this. One of the big concerns that I have, and I think it actually kills people, and it's a shame, and I'm not going to fully cast aspersions on one side or the other, but let's be clear, it's an election season. There is a lot of political propaganda behind public policy, and it's not in the best interest of the current administration, for example, to have people saying this may be the result of open borders or other things that are political hot-button issues. The downside worry to me is when you have a position like this that is this is an appointed position. In other words, Dr. Frieden was appointed in May of 2009 by Obama. That means that the president and his policies, which are basically on trial, as all presidents are during an election season, has the potential to greatly affect public policy. That's a big problem for me, and I really would like to see issues as important as public health removed as much as possible from single-party politics, being able to control that and being moved more to some kind of a bipartisan, maybe congressional oversight, much like the Congress sometimes does with a certain budget issues. So I want to get your thoughts on that, and particularly the political and election ramifications.
Yeah, I've not seen any suggestion or any indication that any of the policies, either the good ones or the not so good ones, the missteps, have been driven or impeded by political party, one side or the other. So I mean, like I said, I think that perhaps the CDC hasn't fully considered some of the statistical implications of transmission as it might have, but to the extent that it could improve in that respect, I don't think it's because anybody of either party whispered in somebody's ear and said, "Don't think about this" or "Do think about that" or so on. So I haven't seen any evidence of that, and I think also there's different organizations that are involved. The CDC, of course, has absolutely nothing to do with decisions about checking about decision. Well, I don't want to say they have nothing to do with, but they're not the ones who have the authority to make the decision about who we allowed to come into the country or not. That authority presumably rests elsewhere. Their primary focus is on things like preventing the infection, helping internationally in the response, and so on. And again, I've seen no evidence that anyone would intentionally injure anyone for political considerations.
Well, I guess the concern I have along those lines is you have a lot of people maybe legitimately calling for Thomas Frieden's head to roll, resign, be fired, etc. But I always look at these types of appointed positions with the the inherent bias, knowing that if you're in an appointed position and what you say doesn't match what the person who appointed you is doing, if in other words it doesn't align or support their public policy, especially in an election season, you may very quickly be forced to resign and ask. So not necessarily that we have evidence that this has happened, but I think just the very fact that it is a possibility and a probability when you look at how many other scandals that we've had in this administration and others, I would call for as much of a separation as possible. You're feel free to comment on that, but then I'm sorry. Go ahead. I interrupted you. No. Go ahead. Go answer that, and then I have one more question before I let you go.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to say, you're certainly correct that just speaking generally, people who are in appointed positions, are sometimes beholden in some sense to those who appointed them. But again, I've seen, and I don't claim to know or have information about every single decision that CDC is or isn't making, and I haven't done a study of them to see how they may or may not have been influenced politically. But of the things that I have seen, and again, there are some things that I'm on record as suggesting weren't done optimally. I personally haven't seen any evidence that there's any political implication there.
Well, I very much hope you're right. Last thing I'd like you to comment on is social media. Do you believe that social media actually has been maybe helping out by both applying public pressure and for raising and increasing, let's say, awareness, as you pointed to earlier, as a need for making people aware and alert, or is it making a false crisis?
I certainly wouldn't say it's a false crisis because it is a very real crisis. But I think it's interesting in the sense that in this case, the role of social media hasn't been as significant in a relative sense as it is in some other events or other developments, just because this has captured the attention of the kind of traditional press to such a degree that sometimes social media can play a very valuable role in, for example, getting out information that for whatever reason isn't getting sufficient attention in the more traditional press outlets. But of course, there's no news website you could go to that I'm aware of at all today and not see news about Ebola quite literally at least once and probably multiple places on the home page. So there's less of a gap right now for social media to fill. Where I can see it changing is if this becomes much more complicated. Right now, the number of cases is, thankfully, even one case is far too many, but the number is thankfully much smaller than it is in other parts of the world. But I can see that if it became much larger, then social media would probably play a much stronger, higher role in keeping people informed about what's actually going on. But right now, it's a very small number of cases, and so you can get a lot of the information just from the traditional press.
Well, let's hope it stays that way. And I actually have some business opportunities to attend to in Uganda before the end of the year, so I have to ask myself that very question.
Okay, well, stay.
How long do I want to wait until I might go there?
Yeah, I hope and any travels that anyone does, I hope that they're safe, and that will certainly include you. So I really appreciate the chance to have spoken with you.
John, absolutely. Very quickly, if you will, let people know where they could follow you and learn more about the works that you do.
Sure. So I am at UCLA. I'm also temporarily for the next couple of months a national fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and I am a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So if people just do some web searches, they'll find me at any of those places. And I wrote a piece today in Slate on this topic, the Ebola topic, and also have published several pieces recently in the last couple of weeks in Forbes also on that topic.
Excellent. John, I like the way you handled the questions. Thanks so much for joining us here in the final segment. We hope to have you on again in the future.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.